Awesome. So hi folks, my name is Richy Srirachanikorn. Hi to you online. I am presenting in an empty room. Hey, check this out. Look at this. Uh, I literally just gave this talk like 30 minutes ago. I love recording talks because, again, it gets us continuing conversations, and it's a nice thing to keep me accountable in terms of not recycling talks. The only reason why this might seem a little pretentious, recording in an empty room, is because I'm part of the Milieu Institute, and thankfully, the Milieu Institute at Concordia University, we have this space, so I'm thankful to them, and it's only in this interesting format where it's a long keynote, what it was, and so if I'm just in the corner, maybe it can get a little boring, so you can shift your eye where you want to look at, just in case, trying something new, all right? But I am talking to you, so it doesn't feel too weird. So I myself, I am a sociologist by training. I study at Concordia University in the PhD Social and Cultural Analysis program with my supervisor, Dr. Mark Simon, who's also the director of the Milieu Institute as well. This talk that I just gave this morning was at the Concordia ReAnimate Summer School. It's been on for 3 years now. They collect a bunch of items and artifacts, as well as folks from computer science, software engineering, UX, UI, and a sociologist from time to time. And they talk about all things retro. And Jan and Gabriel, the professor and student who manages the team there, were very kind to invite me to give a talk this morning on their last day. So thank you to both of you for that, and the team. First and foremost, though, before we get into sort of the retro games, for those of you who are interested in just gaming, nostalgia, but also those of you who may study nostalgia through games, I am a sociologist by training, so we will try to unpack slowly what that means. And so if we look to one corner of the crowd, which are the media psychologists, Nick Bowman, Dan Rieger, Tim Wolfe, for example, Clay Routledge, John Velez, all these folks are pushing sort of part of the nostalgia term, where nostalgia is no longer a regressive, a past-based emotion, right? But it's something that's positive, right? That in spite of being in the past, in spite of being relegated into something that's old, as classic, as retro, we draw so much meaningfulness from these foundations of the past into the present. So what they primarily do is they look at how people react nostalgically to things that are labeled as retro games, as old games, and sort of what Tim Wolfe calls a digital time machine, right? That connects generations together. That a grandfather or a father can talk to a daughter, right, and say, hey, you remember Pac-Man? And then, the daughter who watched Wreck-It Ralph, for example, knew of Pac-Man. And that's a sort of generational bond. So psychologists and media psychologists look at sort of media as a sort of bond maker between generations, but also within the individual. So works by Konstantin Sedekidis as well, who look at nostalgia in terms of the mood improvement, goal-changing, and positive generation emotion, right? And so all of these use cases of things that we label or are told are nostalgic, and how it helps the individual. And then we have on the other end, which are historians and media writers, Simon Reynolds, Dylan Trigg, Tobias Becker, for example. And these folks themselves, they have to deal with sort of, if you're thinking classical historians perhaps, who saw that nostalgia as a trivial and entertainment-based, sort of surface-level engagement with the past. What we can learn from these contemporary works here, particularly with Becker as well, in terms of yesterday and new history of nostalgia, is that actually nostalgia and lived experiences of people matter just as much as historical claims of the past, right? But yes, nostalgia may not be accurate. Yes, nostalgia may be looking at what has happened through rose-tinted glasses, but it still is a huge deal in terms of how we understand the historical work, right? The historical work, interesting shift of placement there, historical work of how people choose what to remember, what to repair, what to reimagine. So when we talk about a great America, for example, even though it was used by Reagan in the 80s, Trump never really tells us when that America was great or made great again. There's some reason since the 80s to now in 2016, 2020, 2024, When he won again, right, he says we're now in the golden age. But what exactly is this golden age consisting of if we've never really been told what was made great already? How do you have something golden, you reach the peak, when you're not even sure if you've climbed the mountain already, right? And so these sorts of, the ways that we mend gaps within narratives of the past, nostalgic stories from the individuals, these historians contend, media writers, says are just as important, right? They're just as important. And one of those historians, Svetlana Boyn, who's no longer with us anymore, wrote this fantastic book called The Future of Nostalgia, and just shifted my thinking about nostalgia. She poses, of course, the question that perhaps nostalgia is not a regressive, a past-ward-looking emotion, but it's a prospective, a future-facing emotion, right? That through nostalgia, or the things that we label as belonging to a good, glorified, good old days past, we can generate things from this object, that it's not just a place of dwelling, but it's a place of creation. And we're going to be kind of exploring that within the context of retro gaming, of how is it that something that's relegated as a genre and as an industry, as belonging in the past, a glorified one, retro games, can give us so much within the present and future, right? And so, as a sociologist, right, we've heard the psychologists as the individual sort of engagement with something that's labeled as nostalgic, and the historians who make the case, right, contemporary ones, that actually within the grand narratives, if we have any anymore, of what has happened between then and now, individual stories make just as much of an impact like buttons on a shirt, right? It holds things together. Where does a sociologist come in? And so a sociologist looks at why individuals do things, why do they feel nostalgic in this moment, but what is the historical reason for that? Sort of the institutions, culture, right? We explain individual moments, the social fabric of why we do things, by looking at the great tapestry, right, of what led up to it. What are the factors beyond the individual? And so currently, as you know, the world is, as always is, uncertain, right? We have so much to worry about that we don't even know what we should be worried about and for how long we should be worried about something, right? Things are always overtaking each other within news cycles. So this uncertainty, this inability to grasp the present has made it so that, according to Fred Davis, one of the first sociologists to talk about nostalgia, he says nostalgia is a social emotion. And what he means by that is two things, right? He says, number one, it's a social emotion because it's an emotion that we have all culturally recognized, that we've learned socially to identify that if somebody or an institution praises a past as nostalgic, it is perhaps a period of time that we should pay a little more attention to. MAGA, right, for example, or the good old days, whatever that meant from our grandparents, right? That we pay a little more attention because it means something for that intergeneration, right? It means something. But the other way as well, from a socialized emotion, is that nostalgia serves a social purpose, right? That despite the uncertainties of the present, it gives us a sort of a sense of comfort, right? Things that we remember that we've lived through, that we've played before, or things that our parents and our grandparents have shared with us, that stay with us, a part of us, our heritage, right? All of these nostalgic things, whether you lived it or you were told how it was lived by somebody you know, they serve a social function of what Fred Davis calls giving us self-clarity, right? And so nostalgia here serves two functions for a sociologist. Yes, it is something that we have identified as culturally important, but it's also important for culture that is always undergoing changes, right? It's important for these two reasons. Fast forward into 2020s, right? Although Michael has been writing a long time about nostalgia as well in liquid modernity, Michael Lee Jacobson talks about how nostalgia helps consumers slow down time, right? That we chase things that may not have come from the past, but look like the past. So, for example, when the toy company Yak Pacific, right? They released the Sonic and Mario figurines, right? It's not exactly the Mario and Sonic that we grew up playing, right? It's not within the cartilage, right? Or it's not within the plushie that is now in some attic, or maybe you donated a toy 20 years ago. But it looks like the past. And just because it looks like the past, it's identifiable by culture, Fred Davis, yes, but it also gives us a sort of, that is something that I'm familiar with. right? So Fred Davis' second definition of nostalgia as a social function of an emotion that gives us cohesion within the uncertain present. So consumers are happy to seek things that resemble the past. That's also what historian Gary Cross calls consumed nostalgia by consumer as well. And then finally, Janelle Wilson, another sociologist, actually makes us think a little bit more than just what we are given now that is told as the past. But she contends that actually if you look back at the past, let's say you remember growing up playing Sonic, right, the Sonic game, and you felt at that time that the world would be as colorful and saturated and bright like the Sonic stage, Green Hill Zone, for example. Now, ever since you've grown up and you become adults and you have to pay taxes, that sort of worldview has maybe faded, right? That the world is really cool and crisp and green and blue. But if you travel back to an encounter with a nostalgic object, which is Sonic, and the feeling that it gave you in the past, sort of the future that child you imagined, if you trace back to that and you remember that motivation, that hope, and you bring it to the present, it gives us a direct through line of a sort of future possible self. That in the past, I dreamt of this. In the past, I hoped for that. Now, because in the present, I'm an adult now, I'm jaded, I'm more cynical, for example, this worldview is lost to time. But if we remember forming these views, we are nostalgic for it. And here's the question. Some people do revisit these optimistic worldviews, and it fuels into activism. It fuels into a grassroots community-based solution. And for me, it fuels into an academic career, right? Talking about all of those optimistic moments I had when I was young, growing up with these games. Wanting a future that is super connected, that is super saturated with technology, but now seeing the state of how it's used to exploit folks, right? Or the AI, the sort of iterativeness of it, the beige, the blasé of it all, right? What later Jacob Birkin calls a digital saturation. So by going back to a time in the past for its future, we can harbor and cultivate our future possible selves. That's by Wilson. And you can see here, right, the sort of line with the prospective, as Boehm said, the prospective uses of nostalgia. But enough theory for now. We're going to go into the context then of retro gaming, right? What does that mean in terms of how we play with these things that ostensibly resemble the past, right? Whether or not it actually came from the past or it's made to look like the past. For me, I'm a sociologist based in game studies, so I look at nostalgia through games, right? Through the angle of games. And just as a quick primer, 3 days ago at the Canadian Game Studies Association, I presented on GTA 4, right? A game that was once really critiqued when it came out because it was very dark and it diverted from the franchises before, since the 1998, I think it was. But then, now, many, many years later, right, a decade later, 2008, people now yearn for that darker, that grittier feel of GTA 4, right? And how the nostalgia is displaced. Something that came out initially is hated, but then with time, it becomes something that's beloved, that's being yearned for again. What does that mean, right? In other examples as well, I talk about the uses of games to help us understand the experience of socially withdrawn folks, right? If nostalgia really is a return home in the classical sense, what do people who are always at home yearn for, right? And so these are the kind of works that I look at using games and written about as well in terms of a prospective nostalgia, which I call a refractive nostalgia, but that's all online. As well as that, within the Milieu Institute as well, in the 2022 period, we founded a collective called the nostagain Network. The nostagain Network combines annually scholars, artists, researchers, caregivers, musicians, etc., who work around or work specifically on nostalgia, but not to think about the past. Sort of all of these works draw on someone's nostalgia, future possible selves, for example, to think about the future. So in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of terminal illnesses, for example, in spite of a bleak present, how do we draw from that wellspring in the past to keep moving forward? And so every year we launch a call out, so you can check us out online, nostagain.ca, or go to our Instagram, nostagain as well. So there's always different avenues, right? Different textures of nostalgia. And so for me, more and more, I come to see that nostalgia is less about a relationship to the past, but more about a relationship with the idea of the past, right? And so the question then becomes, who is in charge of that idea? Where does that idea go to? And as we've seen with GTA 4, as I told you about, that idea shifts, right? And so it's sort of like a playing board of the ice hockey, right? The puck is always moving, but it's still somewhere there. It's still within the frame. It's just always changing and shifting. So if we go back to the original, sort of the classical understanding of nostalgia as a regressive, a retro thing, before we get into games, in 1688, Johann Hofer, a medical student from Switzerland, was writing a thesis on two young adults, two case studies of young adults. One was a male student, and the other was a peasant girl who received treatment. Both of these folks, by the way, were outside of Switzerland, right? So they were away from home, as Hofer insisted. And at the time, there were already cases of Heimweh, or what we call homesickness, right? The German Heimweh, within soldiers and mercenaries. But Hofer didn't focus on mercenaries. He focused on young adults because his whole thesis was nostalgia, right, or homesickness, first of all, applies to more than just people who are stationed abroad. It applies to everyone, specifically young adults, who are undergoing change. That goes back to Fred Davis's point, right, of uncertainty and nostalgia as a social emotion. But also, what is an added value as well, is that nostalgia kills. That within his observations of the two young adults, they weren't just homesick, but they were pestered by the image of the fatherland. That no matter what they did, wherever they went, slowly things around them reminded them of home, right, of Switzerland, of the Alps. And that debilitated any sort of action. So they drank less, they ate less, until they died, obviously, right? It got to the point, actually, where generals banned mercenaries who were stationed abroad from whistling tunes that are played by the Elfhorn. And the Elfhorn is a Swiss instrument, right? Or cowbells. Because for them, nostalgia is not so much what Hofer called the sickness of the imagination of the brain, for example, but it's within objects. That objects around us trigger, pester, broil that sort of deadly Heimweh. And so nostos, the Greek nostos, is a return home, and algos is the ache or the pain. And so to prevent the algos from this nostos, you have to get rid of things that represent that nostos, right? And that's a funny little interesting sort of shift in how we understand something that's so, what's the word for it? Amorphous, right? Formless, by materializing it. Yes, even back then they already pointed to things as representing a past, a nostalgic past, but in a bad way, a regressive past. And then later on in the 20th century, right, Alvin Toffler wrote a 400-page book about young adults within the UK who tend to their parents' and their grandparents' styles, fashion, music tastes as victims of future shock. So to translate that, that means these young adults who go back to these things of the past, quote unquote, are people who can't deal with what's to come. And so Toffler pitched the idea that when people looked back to these past, these objects, right, they did not want to advance social progress. So again, here we are with the whole regressive critique of what it means to be nostalgic and who is nostalgic, right? And these, of course, you can read yourself as well. So it's always in the media with us. But as a sociologist here, what matters more than just objects and individual memories is also the culture, right? There's a sort of triforce thing happening, right? An assemblage, as they call it, of the social, the cultural, and the material, right? That are always involved, maybe more or less, within what we call and what we assign and who we include into nostalgia, right? Who belongs in this past that should be yearned for. So I'll talk to you first about the social aspect. So in 87 and 89, when Contra came out on the Famicom, but also SimCity as well on the Amigo, and the Amigo is not the name for it, is it? See, you can tell by my age, the Super NES as well. My older cousins and my parents played it to death, right? They loved it. It was something revolutionary at the time, yes? And then later on, when I was born, after the 2000s, actually 2000 specifically, I played Contra, but not on the Famicom. I played it on the arcade machine in the mall, right? So it's no longer just an intimate setting within the living room as a first game, but in the context of there are many, many other games by then, and I gravitated to an older look. So in 2007, that was my first time playing Contra. And then 2009 was my first time actually encountering the Sims franchise. Not SimCity, but as many have with their first PC, Microsoft Windows XP, Sims 1, right? And so it's a completely different game as well. But despite this, like the generals and the old historians and the doctors in the 19th century as well, I was told constantly by my cousins, my friends, whose siblings have the Famicom and the Super NES, and by my parents, all the time, that the nostalgia you have today for games like Metal Slug, for example, or The Sims 1, 2, 3, and 4, no. The nostalgia that you have for these games now actually hark back to these. In other words, thank these. This is the original. This is vintage. This is the foundation for your love of video games. This is retro. It's worth longing for. Right? And that's the social aspect again of being told that despite my first love coming in a different medium or a different title inherently, right? That I'm always reminded of what I should be longing most for. The original, the wellspring of it all, right? The drip. And so that's the social aspect. Then we move on to the cultural aspect, right? Which is just as important. If just before I was talking about how individuals tell each other what's to long for through memory, through lived experiences, then we have to also look at the institution level as well with companies, right, and media articles, for example. And so it's in Konami who made Contra, and in Maxis, and then later acquired by EA, it's in these companies' best interest as well to ensure that players, older and younger, talk about which title is retro, because it retains the nostalgic memory of their original game. That despite now, years and years later from the 89, 88, with technological progress, new games that now promise not only better graphics, but better hardware, for example, that the competition is everywhere. And so for them to still retain that, actually, all of these new games, they hark back to the original Contra, the original SimCity. It's in their interest, right, to have that sort of legacy there. And so they like that. Of course, they would keep that. And this is what Jacob Birkin says, right? There's a funny thing about technological progress, that the games of an era become as quickly obsolete as the hardware. How many times have you seen a trailer, for example, for a new game these days, and the first thing that shows up is not the title of the game, but the hardware it was made for, or the generation of the technology, right? How much within the game trailer actually is about the content more than it is about what they offer now. When GTA 5 came out, for example, they spent over half of their trailer talking about the new mechanics that weren't available with other games at the time, and at all within their franchises, telling us nothing really, except the character names, Michael, Trevor, Franklin, about the story. So games have now become tied, right, to the progress through what they can offer in the new hardware, right? And so with all of these pushes into the future, again, Konami, EA, other folks as well, it's in their interest to enshrine their games as the foundation, right? It's useful economically to have that nostalgic, that retro label, yes? And so Peter Mackay, a media scholar as well, says the same thing too, that video games are the newest form of storytelling, but the quickest to be obsolete. That may have changed by now, but you can see here, right, that even in quote-unquote contemporary franchises, not just Contra, not just with Sims, right, but with all of these, Call of Duty, etc., if we highlight the retro, right, for example, GTA, the remaster, the trilogy, right there it is, right? So it's useful for them to retain the golden games, right? And you can see even for Elder Scrolls, right? It's Skyrim that people love, even though it's the 5th installation, or Fallout, right? Like Fallout 3, for example, more and less has become beloved over 1 or 2, even though there are still hardcore, quote-unquote, players who go back to it, right? And so Maria Garda says that, again, it's important for culture and individuals to keep the retro memory alive, right? It helps us with the uncertain present, but it also helps companies retain their position within the uncertain present because of competition, right? And so again, as Suominen, but coming from Havid Jacobson, right, who talks about how consumers are okay with settling with things that look like the past. This is what Suominen calls a nostalgic sensibility, right? That companies curate this sort of what is retro, what is the golden title. GTA, for example, if you visit Steam, many of their titles are legacy titles, right? Whatever the heck that means. And The Sims came out, right? With their Nostalgic Now campaign just about a few months ago. And they call it under the legacy title too. For $70 though, which I am not paying for, that's for sure. No thanks. There is a price, let me tell you that. And so the next thing here, as Garda reinforces, right, just as Boeing says, is that nostalgia is not a property of an object. And it's not just belonging within the memory of an individual, it's the interaction, right? It's the interaction between person, object, culture, or idea, right? It's that idea that shifts. And so it's important, again, from a sociological viewpoint, not just to trace the psychological individual effects of an encounter with something, right? Or a historical use case where nostalgia can help us fill in the blanks. But it's combining all of these together of the why and the how. Why is it that I'm feeling this way, and how is it that I was made to feel this way? And where I come in with this is what next, right? And we'll talk about that towards the end. And then finally, Jacob Birkin, as I talked about, these days, Birkin says the value of a digital game, the newest game, is its ability to make older games obsolete. Because you jump generations of technology, you also skip all the games that were made there. So it's your prowess, it's your interest, that if you develop a game, if you're a AAA, for example, to be able to trump, right, excuse the pun there, trump the other games there. It's to make them old or forgotten, right? And so that was the cultural, yes, first the social, then the cultural. And then we have the material, right? The material aspect is just as important because the material combines not only the social, which is, this is what I've been told is nostalgic, or what I remember as coming from the past, and it just doesn't also exclude the culture, which is sort of how the companies label what is nostalgic. The material is the Venn diagram between the two, right? Because some things may feel new, but it may also conjure up something nostalgic. For example, playing World of Warcraft Classic, right, on a new computer, on the latest Mac, right? Despite the different setup being advanced and new and slick and clean, we still feel an oldness to it because of the content, right? So that's an interesting thing in terms of material. And if we look back, right, just to remind you as well, that the Nostos Naligos all came from objects, right? The objects that the generals, the doctors, the theorists tried to prevent. That objects cause and trigger, but also comfort people's nostalgia. So objects play an important role in terms of relegating that homesickness, right? That algos, that pain. We know now, of course, that there's more than one home we all can long for, and that really we live in a culture where there's more sickness than there is home, right? People displaced all the time, technological progress, uncertainty. So even if you return somewhere that you love and you enshrine, the next thing that's happening on the world news will displace that. We can't dwell in nostalgia forever, right? And so objects help us sort of like running on quicksand, boots to run on quicksand on a muddy beach, a marsh, right? It helps us move forward with that. And so Jacob Birkin as well, as we've mentioned, gave the example of when the Yak Pacific, or the Yacht Pacific, depends if you're British or not, the Yacht Pacific company released what here was the toy that mimics the Atari 2600, right? And they released it in 2003. Of course, the idea behind all of this was that players were able to not only have a feel of the past, yes, of what their parents played through or what they played through as children, but to plug it into the TV and play games instantly. Mortal Kombat, Pac-Man, for example. Now, looking from here, it should be a huge success, yes? It wasn't. Consumers actually rejected these toys, or what Warren calls nostalgic ready-mades, because for them, by the time that the Atari has now become obsolete, or there are new things, and they're moving on to PC, moving on to MMORPGs in the late 90s, for those folks who still yearn and crave for older games, they no longer seek out the original hardware, right, the assemblage in the living room. They're now on the computers, online. And they played multiple arcade machine emulators, MAME, right? And so the trick of MAME, or MAM, again, it depends on the pronunciation, but I'm going to say MAME, all right, is that there was a struggle to it. That you didn't just click now on Steam to buy the game and you'd be able to play it instantly. You'd have to assemble sort of each folders. You'd have to dig and search and hunt to talk to your friends and try to talk to within the communities, right? To assemble a piece of old game to be able to play it. So there was a struggle, there was an algos, an ache to that return home. And that has become, for better or worse, a part of the culture of reviving retro games for these consumers. They didn't like the fact that you can instantly buy something plasticky that resembled the past and instantly play the past. Because the point of main culture then was that you struggled together to play the past. Right? It was in the journey itself. And so if we go back to Garda's idea, right, that companies and individuals have to keep retro titles alive in memory, material aspect comes in and says, be careful how you do that. That yes, there are social, which is the consumers who remind you of what was good, what was the golden age, what is the foundation of nostalgia now, and there's the cultural, which keeps producing and retaining and preserving these legacy titles. But when it comes to consumers, material matters too, right? The look and the feel matters just as much. So instead of nostalgia, which is a longing for the past, perhaps nostalgia is also a search for belonging, a search for that main community, right? A search for those folks who understood the struggle of going through it, not just the product itself, but the process. Yes, following, yes? And then one of the psychologists that we talked about, Nick Bowman as well, with his colleagues, they were trying to look at this specifically within a psychological experiment of controllers. And what they were trying to measure was actually two kinds of nostalgia: personal nostalgia and historical nostalgia. And just to translate that, personal nostalgia is yearning for a past that you remember living through, yes? That you grew up playing, to consume nostalgia, as we talked about. Historical nostalgia is to yearn for a past you never got to live through. So for me, my personal nostalgia is Sims 1 and Contra within the arcade machine. But my historical nostalgia is for SimCity, right, on the Super NES, which I never got to play, or the original Contra on the original consoles, Famicom, which I never got to play, right? Historical, personal. And what Bowman and colleagues wanted to do was to see whether or not the material, the feel of the joystick and the controller, had a say within people's yearning. That do they yearn for a past they never lived through, or for a past that they did live through? So ostensibly, right, suggestively, older players who grew up playing the original NES Classic controller, if they felt this controller, they would yearn for personal nostalgia, yes? And let's say, for example, if a younger player like myself, who's never played NES with the controller itself, touch this controller and feel the difference from what we have conventionally now, I will feel historical nostalgia, yes? And so the way that they did this, interestingly, was also they made sure that people played the game, but they couldn't see the controller. So the controller was covered, right? So it's just by feel alone. And of course, interestingly, the game they chose was Super Mario Bros., probably because the social, the cultural insists that this is a game to yearn for, to preserve, it's a golden past, it's a foundation in gaming culture, right? So what did they find? What did they find? controllers, unfortunately, have not much of a significant role within people's personal and historical nostalgia, right? What they found interestingly instead was that younger players who came to play Mario, even though they never played it or grew up playing it, when they're able to master this game, they're able to beat the stage, they're able to feel that they conquered something before, they felt a sense of historical nostalgia in that way. Oh, that I wish I could have gone back to play that. Or, oh, I wish I could have gone back when my dad and my mom played it, right? Because they recognize that visually, this cue triggered them of a past that one, socially, they were told is a good past, right? A golden game. But culturally, that it is something that should be preserved as the foundation, the bedrock of gaming culture, Mario, right? So it's the social and cultural cues of this visual material, the game itself, that triggered that, right? That they're able to feel a historical nostalgia because they recognize that this is the past, and because they're able to conquer it, they want to go back to experience it the first time. Older players also felt personal nostalgia as well, but not because they played the game. For some participants, Bowman and colleagues note that older players who've never really played games before, they felt familiar, right? Because Mario was everywhere, right? So when they're able to retouch the past again, even though they didn't do it growing up, because they didn't care for games or they didn't have a chance to play, they felt a personal nostalgia because they thought back to the memory, the cultural memory, the nostalgia for Mario was everywhere. So that now it's good, they revisit the past. So you can see here that the cause for people's nostalgias is not so much the controller, but it's the visual, it's the memory, right? It's social and cultural. So the point being here is that just as much as the material, or the visual material as well, matters, it's also the social and cultural triforce, right? That it's always a case-by-case, individual basis, which is why nostalgia has been so difficult to pinpoint down. Not just what you're studying, who you're studying, but even after you've got the right context and participants, how long does that nostalgia stay? Call of Duty, for example, might be a fantastic nostalgic artifact for me, but if I realize later on the Discord channel that one of the the players I used to play with from 10 years ago, passed away, Call of Duty now assumes a sad nostalgia for me. So the longevity that's inherent within nostalgic objects always changes. And we go back to that Birkin quote, right? That nostalgia is always an interaction between people, things, culture, right? And here, with memory, as Bowman gives us. And at UQAM, University of Quebec Montreal, Catherine Niemeyer calls this digital nostalgia, which, in short, is that when you long for something, you don't just long for the media, content, or the machine. You long for the human relations it activated and around it, right? And so within game studies, we have this idea of the magic circle, which is to say that this is where play is at. Yes, the living room carpet, for example, or your gaming room. And scholars like Mia Patel, for example, and some sociologists have come out to say, no, there is no zonal space for where play or memory is formed with these nostalgic experiences. We're always playing, right? We're always thinking about play. Play is more expansive than as is. And so in the context of nostalgia, as we can see here, it's not just within the lab, it's not just within individual stories historically, it's not just within material, it's always up and down, ebb and flow, hence nostalgia waves, right? Ebb and flow, always between these three components. So here I've given you sort of the argument of why nostalgia may be seen as regressive, or why it has to remain retro and regressive in the past because of companies and institutions and individuals, right, who need to keep it as the past, whether good or bad, golden or forgettable. Yes? So there it is. Now we move on. Next level, yes? The Prospo, or as Boehm, yes, as we remember, Boehm saying that nostalgia is not a regressive emotion, but a prospective emotion. So let's have a little dive in that as well. And a drink of water through three case studies, all right? Number one, I'm going to take you back in time 2 years before the time that we've arrived in with our time machine, 2 years before this time, Obama became president. Yes? You remember that? The year before, Steve Jobs released the iPad. Yeah, that was pretty cool. No camera though, unfortunately. 2 years forward from where we are in the past, Gangnam Style came out, right? Once the most watched YouTube video ever. And wow, that was a time, wasn't it? And a year before that was the World Cup. So I'm going to place all of us back in 2011. Yep. In your living room or your attic or wherever it is you played what you played. These were the titles that we had to offer. Right? Dead Space 2, Portal 2, Skyrim, and Uncharted 3. The movie is trash, but the game is brilliant. So you can see here that at this time in 2011, there were all these good graphics games porting to mobile, coming on iOS soon, right? Already that technological progress that was tied, yes, is already intact. It's on its way, right? That games are tied to progress for companies, not just video game companies, but technological companies too. That it was in their interest, right? As Birkin reminds us, that digital games have its value by its claim to make older games obsolete. And then we have this. Right? In 2009, Minecraft came out, alpha versions, and probably within 2011, 2014 was its kind of peak, right? And so when you're given this bare bones, blocky, sort of inferior looking game that slowly became popular, and by the way, it's the most popular game of all time, still until today, that's another paper on its own. What did players do with this? Right? From Dead Space and Portal, and Uncharted 3 with the plane scene and all that, Skyrim. Game scholar Jesper Juhl calls this counterfactual nostalgia. So let me unpack that for you. He says, these games have an independent style, right? Which makes us think of the past, but not a specific past. So when younger consumers like me, who was probably a 9 at the time, or 8 actually, were able to play Minecraft in 2009, I knew that this was different because of its indie look. I knew that this was not the same as the Dead Space to the Portal that was out and about within the ecosystem of gaming, right? That this looked different. But I could not pinpoint where this look came from. Because socially, my parents and my older cousins never played anything that looked like this, right? It wasn't 2D, it was 3D, it was an open world, yes? So pixelated as is, it's not a linear Castlevania or Contra mode, right? This is something new. And culturally, Minecraft was very unique, original, so to speak, right? So there were no cultural or social anchors for me. And so all I had was the material look and the material feel. What did players like me do, according to Juhl? Well, we had to place this out of place artifact somewhere, right? We had to relegate this game somewhere that it resisted the technological progress that was going on at the time. But it still made us feel like it belonged to somewhere in the past as an inferior, a precursor to what we have now. So what we ended up doing was we went and assigned it to the 90s. Now, many of you know the 90s did not look like Minecraft, right? It didn't. But that's the point, right? Counterfactual. That for new, younger players, we had to relegate this to any past, right? And so we said it looked like the 90s. It looked like before PCs came out, or when it first came out, right? Internet gaming came out. It looked like during that time, even though we never lived through it, and we can't really explain why. And so that's why Minecraft triggers a sort of displaced, searing nostalgia that is never in place, that you can never point to. And different, right? Different to Contra and SimCity, right? Which these original retro games can stand in as the cause, the leading up, the drip to the wellspring of games we have now of Contra-like games. or Sims-like games, right, that we can trace back to these original standpoints. Minecraft players did not have any of that. Nothing since or before at the time looked like it. So it was sort of an anomaly. And so what this produced, the prospective, the generated nostalgia, as we call it, the generated nostalgia is that it creates a conversation, right, between younger folks who are playing it, talking to their parents and their siblings and their friends, like, what do you think about this? Or, you know, we might say that it looks like it comes from the 90s, but certainly my dad said, the 90s did not look like this, right? He still was prideful about the games that he played in the 90s, the point-and-click, the MMORPGs, for example, WoW in the 80s. But certainly Minecraft looked out of place even for them. So there's an interesting sort of hot potato going between the intergenerations, right? If Wolf told us that video games are a nostalgic digital time machine, then this is a sort of digital time bomb, right? Who wants it? Who wants it? But it produces it back, right? It's like the Yak-specific consumers who rejected the nostalgic ready-made, the TV game controllers, right? That in the confusion, in the ache, the algos, it produces critical thinking about what the past looks like and what belongs to it. So it produces that generational conversation, yes? And so Minecraft, as many other games like Cuphead, for example, are examples of what Keali and Shu call a contemporary retro game, right? Which is a game that has a modern gameplay with a retro look. And so to explain that, Minecraft has the blockiness look, right? Sort of reminds you of Jenga or Lego, yes? A referent without a referent, that it looks like childhood for you. And so it should be retro. Yet, for those who played Minecraft, you know that it's a very modern game in the sense that there's no story, really. And even until now, when you finally go to the last dimension, right, of, they call it the end, and you slay the dragon, after the credits roll, you come back to your world. And for most players who play Minecraft, they go to the end not to kill the dragon because it's the last stage, like in Mario, which is like Bowser, for example. But they go to the end to kill the dragon because they need to unlock Elytra or wings, right? That improves their existing game that they continue to. So that there is a game after the last stage, so to speak. Minecraft is modern in that sense, in that the story really doesn't matter, right? It's what the players do. And so with this confusing timelessness of the gameplay, but also Monen and Microsoft, the companies who own Minecraft now, they refuse to put Minecraft in a specific past. They refuse to categorize Minecraft as being timed, as old, as vintage, right? That they keep Minecraft relevant all the time with the popcorn throwing movie, right, with Jack Black. So the timelessness from the social and the cultural, but the retroness of the material confuses the heck out of people, yeah? And so that's why it's a contemporary retro game that can produce things for the present and future. Conversations out of confusion. And I take this even further, right? Like folks like myself, we grew up in the digital ecosphere, right, of YouTube, since it got popular in 2009 onwards, of the first wave Minecraft YouTubers, let's call it that, first wave. So Captain Sparkles, Yogscraft, for example, who showed us different ways to play Minecraft with mods, let's plays, but also music videos, right, of Minecraft looking entertainment. And then the second wave, the Renaissance, within the 2020, which was the pandemic, obviously, and we had YouTubers like Dream or Ish, for example, who included a more social aspect, right, like players civilized, simulate civilization within Minecraft, a large server, or for Dream, different ways to beat the game, or speed running, right? So it's a different use of the game from what was a creative first wave Minecraft YouTuber sludge, has now become a mastery, right, of creative Minecraft YouTubers as well. So Minecraft in itself has shifted in its use case from a creative thing to a mastery thing. And with the third wave, let's call it that just came out not too long ago, since the pandemic, are YouTubers who focus primarily not on how we can master the game or making Minecraft a music video like other games, but staying with Minecraft itself, its blocky retro timelessness, right? And what these YouTubers do is sort of a quasi-commentary, they just narrate things about their lives or give advice, and they just build. And what's important about these YouTubers in this third wave is that they revert the version of Minecraft. They don't just settle with the latest Minecraft update, where more than just a dragon, we now have something called a warden, which is in the deep dark, or fishes, like the guardians that shoot lasers at you. Who needs all that crap, right? They go back to before the dragon. They go back to a version of Minecraft when there weren't a million blocks, but there were only a few, minimalist, right? They go back to a version of Minecraft before hunger existed, and before you could even sprint. So Minecraft now goes back to that grind, creative grind, where everything is slower. If we think back to Jacobson, right? That nostalgia helps consumers slow down time in life. And interestingly, with these softwares called CurseForge, right? Players now, anybody, by the way, if you download this, can use different mods, but can also revert the game. So we see here a case where players intentionally are regressive with something that's new and timeless in order to reach back to that future possible selves that Wilson talked to us about, right? That young me, that creative me that I wanted to do all these things, but now I'm a student or an adult and I have no time, or games today don't allow me to be as creative, right? So we regress in order to be prospective of what we always wanted, to have the game experience we always wanted, the freedom we want that games today can't really offer. Just as we talked about, and just like the meme, or the meme again, British or American, nostalgic chase. So we see here that beyond just the game, the artifact itself, through the YouTube example of the CurseForge, there's a social, there's a cultural, and there's a material aspect to a nostalgia that's generative within the context of a quote-unquote retro-looking game, right, or contemporary retro game, right? That's important. The second case that I'll be talking about is retro gaming in the context of new games that assume retro look, right? So UFO 50, but before I talk about that, Cuphead, for example, or Shovel Knight, for example, right? All of these modern games, quote unquote, that assume an older look. And you see these with indie studios, right? Independent studios that develop this because of, it's less expensive than AAA games with all the good graphics and the motion captures and hundreds of billions of line and voices to add. But if you just relegate the game to a creative lineage with the pixels and the old ways, you not only save yourself money, but you also tap into a consumer who aren't already searching for games like this, but who remember growing up playing games like this, yearning for things that look retro. So it makes economic sense for game companies to do that, right? And so retro gaming in this sense by Birkin is not a game that existed in the past, no. It's any game that assumes the look of obsolete or obsolete looking games, right? It's that disguise of what the past is, right? It's to wear the cloak. And so in the context of UFO 50, which James Cartledge just released a fantastic paper in Games and Culture just this year, UFO 50 was developed by a studio called Mossmouth, right? And within UFO 50 itself, there are 50 games. Actually, there's 51 games, but 50 games that look like the old Doom, for example, Castlevania. So it's a game that puts players, young and old, into the past, right? But interestingly, when players play one of the first games, Barbuta, right, for example, you see here on the left-hand side, you spawn into a castle and you're facing right. Now, with social and cultural and material remembrances of how to play an old retro-looking game, one of the first moves that we all do, if not to jump, is to move right. Think of Mario, right? That you have to move right because the screen can't go left anymore. It's to progress forward. Games like Braid, for example, by Nomodon, also tells us to go right, right? When players go right, they're immediately crushed by the ceiling. So within the context of this retro-looking game, Mossmouth, the developer, knows that players carry with them the social, cultural, and material expectations of how to play a game that they've been told is nostalgic. Or in other words, they rip up the playbook that even though retro games look old, it is not inferior. It is not predictable, and most importantly, it is not easy. Yes? And so when new and old players open up Barbuta and they press right, they die instantly. Worse, you spawn in. There are no tutorials, there are no cutscenes. Many old players right now who are watching might remember because sort of the fun, the algos again, right? Of talking to your friends or waiting to go home or calling up on the phone and your mom's yelling at you because you're using the landline to ask your friend and siblings, how the heck do you pass this stage, right? We don't have YouTube tutorials nowadays. So this emulates, this takes us back to that context, social, cultural material, or the lack of what an old game, a retro game was, right? It takes us back in time. And this is what Robin Sloan calls a shattering of nostalgic selectiveness. Or in other words, to take our expectations of how a nostalgic thing should be and to break it, to trouble it, to shift it, right? And this generates a critical viewpoint of, ooh, retro games like Minecraft or like Barbuta, for example, aren't predictable and easy, right? That younger folks like me can appreciate the grind and the mastery it took my parents, that it took my siblings and cousins, for example, to play retro games that they spent hours and hours on. Not because, you know, that was a revolutionary thing, but because it was the struggle, the algos within it is the nostos, yes? And Thibault actually says that now we have sort of, with all this technological progress, the promise of new games bringing new things and new hardware. Or as Birkin says, the value of digital games is to make games obsolete and old and forgotten. We're sick and tired of this crap, right? Oh, it's new mechanics again, new stuff again. We yearn for the old. We yearn for a slower, calmer engagement, whether or not that came from the past or it's told to us that it comes from a past, right? And so it leads to a renewed taste for the analog, as Thibault says, right? Not to go to the past, but to hold something, right, that is not sold as progress, that is not too speedy, that is just right. And we see this beyond games too, other than Cuphead and revived games like this or UFO 50. We see that within our TikTok and Instagram trends, right? Sort of that gravitation to an old look, what we call fruited arrow, right? Or the interface of Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, right? Recently, Apple just released their liquid glass look within iOS 26, right? And people are saying, oh my God, it makes me feel nostalgic for Windows Vista or for Linux, for example, because it's all gray, right? And here, flip phones as well, right? And within vinyl sales, vinyl, right, the CDs, the highest clientele right now are Gen Z. So you see here that we respond to that cultural change, that sort of retro games as a vehicle, as a wheels to a car that says, we have to keep moving forward. The young generations are saying, wait, hold on, I want to look at the road too. I don't just want to drive, I want to look at the view behind, right? And so there's a sort of push and pull there that's going on. Again, another paper on its own. And so Garda says that things like Minecraft with CurseForge and the YouTuber, the third wave YouTubers who intentionally regress and revert to an older version of the game is going back to a better past. A past that's not too complicated, no dragons, no crap like that, just creation within my Minecraft world game. Jacob Birkin says, actually, the past may not always be better. You know, older games have its pros and cons, right? Certainly newer games are as enjoyable or not even more. But it's a starting point for emancipatory approaches. In other words, it liberates us, it unchains us from saying, you know, this is what we should strive for, this is the new kinds of games. Or it liberates us from the expectation of what a retro game should look like. Things like UFO 50 that shatter our nostalgic selectiveness, like Robin Sloan says, frees us, both old and young players, from expectations that are made from social, cultural, material needs that they can redefine or reimagine. So then nostalgia here, through reimagined retro games that shatter our expectations, is a prospective artifact, that it creates new ways of thinking about what was, or what we were told was, right? Third and last case. If any of you now have goosebumps or are thinking about that, I appreciate you. This is the iceberg within a fantastic, legendary MMORPG, massive multiplayer online role-playing game called Club Penguin. And billions of kids out there, I'm sure, have grown up playing Club Penguin from 2005 to 2017 when it shut down. Regardless of the point, this is a point-and-click game online. And the iceberg is a hidden room on the map, right? So there's a map, you click on it. This has always been a static JPEG. In other words, whatever you click on here, with the exception of the upload wrapper there, which is a minigame, nothing happens. Now, what happened throughout time, from 2005 to 17, was players slowly started to reanimate this static picture. They created the story, or the lore, that if penguins, or players, came to the iceberg, equipped their hard hat helmets, which is an item in the game, and pressed D to dance, they would be able to quote-unquote tip the iceberg, right? And I've always done it. I spent hours meeting new friends, talking to people by just pressing D to dance on this iceberg. I spent hours on it as a young kid, right? And so in 2017, when Disney, who acquired Club Penguin by then, they responded to fans' nostalgia by tipping the iceberg, right? Oh, wow, it's like an itch finally in the back. Oh, thank you. Yet, even after Club Penguin shut down in 2017, the iceberg proverbially tipped right back over, in the sense that we were all still hungry to reanimate something that is static, or to revive something that has long been dead. Private servers of Club Penguin started showing up everywhere, right? Who knows who owns these things? Multiple private servers to bring back Club Penguin the way it was, even though it's been shut down since, right? Yet all of these private servers were shut down by Disney. Other than the IP and copyright, they were also not safe, yes? A bunch of concerns for privacy as well, but also when players like me log back on, people are now able to swear because these private servers are no longer moderated by Disney employees, right? People not only just swore, people talked about Trump and COVID and all of these things that I don't want to think about. Because when I go back to Club Penguin, it's not just the look, not just the material, it's a social and cultural, which is kids, when I was young, like me, who just wanted to play games. Or talk about Obama, for example, and how he's a funny name, right? But these private servers couldn't give us that. It gave us something that looked old, but is in the new. So it's an itch that actually gives you a bleeding, you know what I mean? That's a horrible metaphor. And so, in my paper, I wrote about this as well. What emerged from this sort of frustration, right, that you can't restore the past, the nostalgic Club Penguin, was that players like myself, who have now grown up, yes, finished university, now have degrees, etc., we came together to create the Club Penguin in real life. So, for example, in the University of Greenwich, right, in the UK, a bunch of folks came together to found the Club Penguin Society. And just as a sort of context here, in December of every year in Club Penguin, since I think 2010 or 11, Disney had this sort of party that lasted a month every December called Coins for Change. In Club Penguin, and those of you who played it, you will know you cannot buy coins. Coins, the in-game currency, was only made and earned through the time that you took to grind that stupid pizza game. So players like me would spend days and hours and weeks grinding millions of coins in order to buy something, right? And so when Disney released the Coins for Change party every December, players like I had the chance to donate our virtual coins, or our time, right, our labor, another great paper for Capital and Club Penguin, to donate our labor through 3 charities. What Disney did was they took the equivalent of the in-game donation coins and they donated the equivalent of that, or however they calculated it, with their own profits. So this was an old game, right, that made students like myself in middle school talk about what was better, forestry, saving the forest, refugees, or healthcare, right? And so we had all of these sort of outside of the game conversations about what charity we would donate to and if we could afford it, right? A budget for the Coins for Change. The University of Greenwich continued that tradition that every December they came together and they donated to 3 charities. So you see there that they took something that was in the past, they did not let it dwell and die, right? But they created something for the future, for other people's futures, right? Here we see again, communities like Discord, for example, that no longer relegate around to play Club Penguin together visually on a web platform, but they came together to talk about people's memories, people's collections of Club Penguin memorabilia, ephemera, right? So all these communities actually generate new ways of quote-unquote playing Club Penguin without actually playing Club Penguin, playing with the memories, with the collectibles that people once didn't care about but now mean so much to them, right? And very impressively, sometimes in these servers, people change their names to the username that they used back in the past. So people who used to be friends when they were 6, 7, 8, or 9 on Club Penguin 10 years ago now found each other as 20-year-olds, right? So there's that perspectiveness too. And probably the most heartfelt thing I have to say is, watch this. The Disney employees and the original company's employee who used to make Club Penguin back in 2005 onwards have now teamed up with young kids like me who grew up playing Club Penguin, who went to university, graduated with a CS degree, software engineering, whatever, and both the developer and the players of this nostalgic thing have now come together to create the next Club Penguin for the new generation, which is called Party Parrot World, right? How beautiful is that? So you see, right? You see that in spite of Club Penguin being shut down, or as we talked about the iceberg, a proverbial static thing, yes? We're not just doing something that tips it over back and forth, you know, here's a Club Penguin private server, here's the original Club Penguin. We're moving beyond Club Penguin itself to do the Club Penguins within the Discord, within the collectibles, to do Club Penguins within university societies and Coins for Change and activism, and to do the Club Penguin within the context of a new game based on Club Penguin, Party Parrot World. It's that combination, right, that makes sure that something that should have been, or could have been regressive, that Disney wanted to remain as a golden title, is now prospective, that it creates things. And so to conclude, yes, within retro gaming, or gaming cultures and companies, that has the interest to label things as retro, as a golden title, right? As the good game, the standard. They make sure that some titles remain in the past, yes? Within the context of a sociologist, yes, for a sociologist, I would contend that different games, whether they come from the past or not, all have the ability to be prospective, which I call the nostalgic potential in my Club paper, right? The nostalgic potential of media objects, specifically video games, because video games allow for individuals to reimagine and have a hand in it. It's not a film, a franchise, a fast food chain. It's a game that players like me can grow up remembering, playing, having fond memories of. Then over time, we have skills in university and grown up and went into the world, and come back to take the good parts of that and give it for the new, younger generations, right? There's a nostalgic element to that involves the social, cultural, and material aspect. But all in all, again, retro gaming, or for sociologists with the prospective uses of gaming, the nostalgic potential, we are still down to the question of what is nostalgia. As Fred Davis reminds us poetically, objects change of what we point to and call and label as nostalgic. The objects change, but the emotion stays the same. The emotion nostalgia that makes us all players to this game, right? That we're always searching for a justification of what was, a justification of what could be. Objects change, the material, social context changes, but the emotion stays the same. It bonds us together. And if it does it anyway, why don't we use it as a sort of rope into the future, to hang on to something for what's to come? Yeah? So that is my talk in terms of retro, Prospo, or I don't know, which is still an emerging field, a thing, and nostalgic studies is very young, for example. If you are interested in that, for example, please reach out to me at Srirachanikorn, that's my last name, at gmail.com, or even go to nostagain.ca/about, or find us on Instagram, nostagain. We're always interested in how people combine the social, cultural, material uses of nostalgia as a prospective thing, just as Weimar does. Again, I thank the ReAnimate School, and very grateful for the Mazur Institute as well for their use of the space, and the Technoculture Arts and Games Lab. That's pretty good, all right? Thank you so much. Now, how do I end this thing? I think that's it, huh? Hold on a minute. It's been years since Zoom, and I still don't know how to do that. There we go.